The most effective way to learn a second language is by being exposed to it as much as possible and by using the language in a natural environment. Preferably, of course, in a country where the language is spoken. In the school context, there are two types of bilingual education which are relatively similar to this natural acquisition and which have proved to be very successful in terms of language competence: immersion and CLIL, content and language integrated learning. In this short presentation, both approaches will be briefly characterized. In traditional foreign language teaching, learners are exposed to the language only for a very short period of time, perhaps a few hours per week. Immersion, on the other hand, is like a language bath. A learner virtually dives into a language and is more or less completely surrounded by it. Over time, students learn to move like a fish on the water. In other words, they become very competent in this language. The general idea of immersion is that most of the curriculum is taught through a second language. This usually means at least 50%, but in many cases it will be much more than this, often 60 to 80%. Immersion can occur in quite different contexts. Sometimes pupils who speak the majority language at home are taught in a second or minority language. In fact, the modern concept of immersion originated in Canada in the 1960s, when English-speaking parents in Quebec, in the French-speaking part of Canada, initiated an immersion project so that their children would become competent speakers of French. But learning a language through immersion can also be part of a heritage program. In this case, it can be a helpful tool to prevent a native language from becoming extinct. In other cases, an international language, quite often English of course, might be taught in an immersion setting. Whatever the context, the main objective in all cases is usually to achieve pluralism and linguistic enrichment. In other words, additive bilingualism. Initially, there's often a strong emphasis on the new language, while the first language is focused on at a later stage, so that eventually native-like levels are achieved in both languages. There are different types of immersion depending on two main factors: age, that is when immersion starts, and the degree of intensity, that is the amount of immersion that is introduced in a school context. We talk about early immersion when it is introduced in kindergarten or in primary school. The term delayed or middle immersion is often used when it is introduced, for example, in 3rd or 4th grade. And we talk about late immersion in secondary schools. Depending on the degree of intensity, we can distinguish between partial and total immersion. Traditionally, most researchers talk about partial immersion when only about half of the classes are taught in a language. Total immersion means that the target language is taught almost exclusively in the classroom. In this case, the first language, which might be the majority or the minority language, is typically just taught as a subject, but not used as a tool for instruction in other subjects. Of course, there's a wide range of programs, and the degree of intensity can vary a lot too. In fact, it may even change from year to year. Perhaps the most common and the most effective form is early total immersion, since it allows for the longest exposure to the second language. A special case is double immersion, which refers to the teaching of two non-native languages as media of instruction. The term CLIL stands for the combination of content and language in a school context. CLIL is an umbrella term and generally speaking denotes any educational situation where an additional language is used for the teaching and learning of subjects. Content and language integrated learning has become quite popular throughout Europe. It refers to a number of similar approaches in Europe to teach content subjects through an additional language. That is a language which is not the most widely used language of the environment, quite often an international language like English, for example. A few related terms which are also used are bilingual content teaching, bilingual subject teaching, or content-based language teaching, but CLIL has become the dominant term in recent years. The idea behind CLIL is very tempting and sounds like a slogan we all know from advertising. Buy one, get one free. This means that one acquires the language almost effortlessly. You acquire the language simply by studying the content of a subject in that language. If, for example, in geography, the topic volcanoes is taught in school, this usually includes the teaching of subtopics such as different types of volcanoes, volcanic activity, volcanic materials, plate tectonics, or the consequences of volcanic eruptions. From a linguistic point of view, therefore, a CLIL approach leads to an increase in vocabulary, both in terms of technical terminology and general vocabulary. For example, students learn to use technical terms such as magma, lava, or crater, but also phrases such as to cause damage or to be in danger. They improve their language skills by reading, writing, or speaking about volcanoes. And they also acquire certain academic discourse skills by describing, explaining, or classifying things. At the same time, grammar and spelling skills are also promoted, of course. In the CLIL classroom, students develop what Stephen Cummins once called BICS and CULP. BICS refers to the basic interpersonal communicative skills, which are essentially the same skills that are normally also promoted in a regular foreign language classroom. Everyday vocabulary and basic speech acts like asking questions or giving information. CULP, the cognitive academic language proficiency, goes beyond this. This term includes special academic vocabulary, which is needed to talk or write about specific phenomena. It would also include the linguistic means which are essential when so-called discourse operators such as describing, defining, or classifying are needed. A simple example: when learning about the human body, students in a traditional foreign language classroom probably only learn words such as head, arm, leg, foot, or bone. In CLIL lessons on the human anatomy, however, more specific expressions such as collarbone, pelvis or thigh bone, or even cranium or tibia are introduced and part of the curriculum. Of course, in a regular foreign language classroom, some content is also included. For example, dialogues, short texts about tourist attractions or traditional holidays or festivals. But the focus is on the foreign language and its vocabulary and its structures, and not so much on the content itself. In CLIL lessons, however, it is rather the other way around. The contents are given special weight. The language is being learned along the way, as it were. This would also mean that new vocabulary or new grammatical structures are acquired by listening or reading, and not necessarily with the help of vocabulary lists or grammar rules. In principle, CLIL covers 4 dimensions, namely communication, culture, content, and cognition, as shown in the so-called 4 C's model by Doug Hoyle, Philip Hood, and David Marsh. The first dimension is communication. In other words, one of the main objectives is, of course, to improve the overall language competence in the target language, in particular oral communicative skills. The second dimension is content. This means that learners gain subject-specific knowledge in an additional language. The third dimension, culture, refers to the fact that learners develop intercultural communicative competence, which in the long run leads to greater understanding and tolerance towards other cultures. The fourth dimension is cognition. This means that bilingual speakers develop specific cognitive skills, such as, for example, metalinguistic awareness or divergent thinking processes. Content and language integrated learning can be adapted to all levels of education. we find it in primary, secondary, and tertiary education. In other words, throughout the entire educational system. In primary education, we may find CLIL classes or even schools where a minority language is used as the language of instruction, for example in bilingual border regions in Europe, for example in Italy in southern Tyrol, or in Germany in areas close to France. In this context, the use of CLIL would be a combination of additive and maintenance bilingual education. Learners maintain their family language, while they also acquire a higher language competence in the society they live in. Although the input and the exposure to the second language is typically less intensive in a CLIL classroom than in an immersion classroom, CLIL can also be a good instrument to gain competence in an international language. In many European countries, there are schools where English, or in some rare cases German or French, are used as the language of instruction. In some cases, such programs are based on initiatives by parents who want their children to be educated in a foreign language from an early age on. That's why some of the children already went to a bilingual kindergarten or a bilingual preschool. As far as secondary education is concerned, we find different systems of CLIL across Europe, but in general what they share is that one or more content subjects are taught in a foreign language for at least 4 years. The age when CLIL is introduced may vary greatly, perhaps from 10 to 18. The main language in Europe is of course English, again with French and German ranking second and third respectively. The content subjects which are chosen most frequently are the humanities and social sciences, in particular history and geography. In some countries, natural sciences are also taught, at least experimentally. In general, however, any subject can be taught, including physical education, music, or arts. There are also quite different models of teaching CLIL. In many cases, there are bilingual classes or so-called bilingual tracks, where at least one subject, but quite often 2 or more subjects are taught in the second language, for example history and maths. Bilingual modules and projects are rather limited in time and are integrated into the curriculum only for a restricted period. Quite often they are interdisciplinary projects in which language teachers and teachers of various other subjects work together. In tertiary education, we find CLIL mainly at vocational schools and colleges. In these cases, the teaching of CLIL refers to the fact that specific academic subjects are taught in a second language, for example, IT, physics, medicine, engineering, mechanics, economics, and business studies. At universities, we hardly ever find CLIL. In this case, it's rather referred to as English medium instruction, which often aims at the internationalization of universities. There are, however, also several challenges in the context of CLIL. One problem is often the lack of appropriate CLIL materials for individual subjects, since they are produced for a relatively small market. Therefore, teachers often need to produce their own materials. Another challenge is assessment. It is clear that language itself should not be assessed as such, but it is argued sometimes that a student's poor performance might have been caused by a lack of linguistic skills. Therefore, language support is crucial in a CLIL context, and teachers need to develop interactional strategies which help to make the input more comprehensible for learners. Finding good CLIL teachers is another problem. They need to be language experts as well as experts in a certain field and CLIL experts, especially since CLIL methodology is different from foreign language teaching methodology or the methodology in a particular subject. Despite all these challenges, in general, immersion and CLIL are considered to be very effective forms of language acquisition, and there are numerous benefits. Communication takes place in a very natural context. In many ways, the process of language acquisition is quite similar to the process of acquiring one's first language. Content and language are acquired together. Pupils use languages to learn and learn to use languages at the same time. Compared with traditional language teaching, proficiency in the second language tends to be a lot higher. Through CLIL or immersion, a high level of academic achievement across all subjects and grade levels can be achieved, which may increase the learner's motivation and confidence. All in all, language is the key to understanding new content. On the other hand, focusing on new content in turn helps to improve one's language skills.